Hi there, students. I'm XS. That's little x, little s, which stands for extra sweet, because that's what I am. How's everyone doing? Today we're going to talk about particles in Japanese, and in particular, I want to hone in on the particles e and ni. There they are. Particles in Japanese can be tricky, but if you can believe it, they're actually simpler now than they used to be. We've already talked a little bit about wa and ga and how much ink has been spilled over when and how those are going to get used. Well, e and ni can also be a little bit tricky, but I have a trick for thinking about them that I personally find to be very helpful. Maybe you'll agree. E is used in cases where something is moving through space. It's about travel. Ni is used in cases where some action is occurring in a space. It's about locating the place where a verb takes place. I'm going to show you some examples to help you understand this distinction, but basically both e and ni are particles that relate in some way to things occurring spatially. It's spatial deixis, which is something that we've talked about before. We're going to use the e particle most often to discuss movement. Something goes from here to there. Someone moves to a new location. But the ni particle will most often be used to indicate a location in which some action or some event is occurring. Notice that I'm saying most often, and that's because Japanese particles are honestly notoriously difficult to pin down. They are versatile little helping words, but the fact that they're so versatile can actually make them a little bit slippery and hard to use. Anyway, let's break this down with a few examples so that we can see how these particles play out in natural language use. Doko ni iku no? So here's a simple question. Here, doko means where. We know that iku means to go, that's the verb. No is acting as a question marker, and in this case we have ni marking the location where the action is happening. The where in where are you going? And then here's this second example. Doko e iku no? Right? And this time we're using the e particle. Again, doko means where, iku means to go, no is a question marker, and then we have the e particle, which indicates the direction of travel. So there we go. They're the same. I hope that cleared things up for you. See you next week. No, I'm only teasing. But my point was that there are certainly cases where e and ni are nearly indistinguishable. They really are almost the same. And yet, they're also not the same. So let's look at some other examples and we'll see if we can get a better understanding of their differences. Kyoto ni sunda. This is a perfectly good sentence that means I lived in Kyoto. It's in the plain past with the verb sumu, meaning to live somewhere. Ni, in this case, is marking the exact location of the verb sumu, to live. Well, now let's look at this sentence. Kyoto e sunda. This sentence is quite simply incorrect. We previously saw a pair of sentences where ni and e were interchangeable, but in this one, they are certainly and definitely not interchangeable. And we see the same thing here. 11時に寝ます. It means I go to sleep at 11. But 11時へ寝ます doesn't really mean anything at all. And that's because in the first case, we're using ni to locate an event in time. But we can't do that with e because it's not talking about movement through space. It's talking about time. Ni can be used to locate an event in time because ni is about the verb. But e cannot be used to locate an event through time because e is about travel through space. In other words, ni has a much more broad range of uses, and yet it's also at the same time weirdly more specific, since it can be used to locate things in space and in time, while e is only going to be used in cases where something is traveling or someone is going somewhere. Let's look at another example. Okay, so now with these two sentences, we can really start to understand one of the differences between ni and e. So the top sentence is 飛行機は日本に飛ぶ. And the bottom sentence is 飛行機は日本へ飛ぶ. Well, what's the difference? When it's related to location and movement, ni will be used in cases where the movement is towards a very specific destination. In other words, the airplane is moving to Japan. It's headed to Japan, and that's its destination. But with e, the movement of the airplane is just in the direction of Japan. It doesn't necessarily have to be landing in Japan. Maybe it's headed towards China or Korea or Russia or somewhere else. We don't actually know whether or not Japan is the destination. We just know that the airplane is moving in the direction of Japan. And that's the important point that I want to make about the distinction between ni and e. Ni is always going to mark a location based on the specific area where some verb is taking place, or the specific time when some verb is taking place. As in, I live in some certain place, or I'm going to some certain place, or something is going to happen at some certain time, or something happens at some exact location. But on the other hand, e is really used for movement through space. It's about heading in a direction of movement. Puppy-Sensei e no tegami o kakimasu. Here's another use of e that I'll highlight for you. So this sentence, it means I'm writing a letter to Puppy-Sensei. Tegami means letter. It's literally hand paper. And then kakimasu is the verb kaku, which means to write. That no particle there is linking the Puppy-Sensei e and tegami. And that's because by itself, Puppy-Sensei e means in the direction of Puppy-Sensei, to Puppy-Sensei. So Puppy-Sensei e no tegami is a letter headed in the direction of Puppy-Sensei. And this is also the opening of a letter. So Puppy-Sensei e, or anybody e, is used exactly the same way that we would use the phrase to Puppy-Sensei or dear Puppy-Sensei. Ultimately, though, we're once again seeing that e is being used to mark something as moving through space. It's moving in a direction, and it's moving in the direction of Puppy-Sensei. I think this brings us back full circle to e being used in cases where something is moving through space, and ni being used in cases where something is occurring within a space. The particle e is used in general sentences that involve some sort of movement from place to place, such as heading towards somewhere, even if that isn't your final destination. But ni is used to mark the destination of a verb, where something happens, or when something happens, because it's talking about specificity. Something happens finally in a place. And that's why I like to remember that ni means in. I want to admit that this really isn't the whole story. There are some outside cases where e and ni are going to be used in other ways. But I really wanted to specifically discuss the way that these two particles relate to spatial deixis, how they relate to events happening in space, and how they relate to events happening through space, through movement. But there's one more thing that I want to say before I close the book on these two particles for the day, and that's the fact that e used to be a lot more prevalent in Japanese literature and still has a certain literary flair to it. So when you find yourself in a situation where you want to choose between doko ni iku no and doko e iku no, you could ask yourself how you want to sound. E, in this case, sounds to my ear just a little bit more formal and with a bit more of a flourish. It's almost a little academic. It can sound just the tiniest bit more poetic, and I kind of think that that's sort of cool. Having said that, I think there's a tiny bit of evidence that Ni is becoming way more popular among young people. And because these two particles do have a somewhat similar set of uses, it's even possible that eventually we could see that E particle die out altogether because people just start using Ni instead of using E at all. We'll see. I don't know what the future holds. Anyway, I do know that I'll see you next week, so... また来週